Croc, The Legend of Gobbos was released in 1997 for the original PlayStation, PC, and of course, the SEGA Saturn. In 2000, it would even make its way to the Game Boy Color. The footage you're seeing here was captured on the Saturn, which is what you've come to expect these days. I remember when I first started hearing about this particular game in magazines of the time. It was being developed by Argonaut Games. Now you might remember them as the fine folks that made the original Star Fox on the Super Nintendo. What I didn't know back then was that Croc originally started development on the Nintendo 64 as a 3D Yoshi game. When Nintendo rejected the idea, Argonaut was forced to look for financing and publishing away from Nintendo, and that would actually end the two's relationship, which was unfortunate. Argonaut would later say that it was actually their demonstration for Croc, or that would-be Yoshi game, that would actually inspire Nintendo to make Super Mario 64. But as these things always go, who knows what the actual truth is. One thing to note about all of these early 3D games is that they're kind of hard to play today in 2017. There's little to no camera control, so you'll see the camera zip around wildly depending on my movements in the game. The camera can also get stuck behind walls and so on. We really take for granted how innovative Super Mario 64 was at its time for introducing the camera control scheme it did. But once you play a game like this, you really start to understand just how important that setup was for Super Mario 64. Croc plays very much like an early 3D platformer from the time. You can run, jump, attack with a butt stomp or a tail whip, you can swim, climb fences, and much more as you make your way through the game's 45 different levels of action, platforming goodness, all while you try and rescue your furry friends. Croc's biggest problem is the aforementioned camera. Unlike Super Mario 64, your camera control is limited to non-existent. The camera's default position is pretty much directly behind Croc and a little bit to the side. While this isn't too problematic at the beginning of the game, once platforms are really introduced and start moving and disappearing or are timed, you'll find yourself falling repeatedly, which gets really frustrating. I felt the need to compare this to Super Mario 64 because I was wondering, well, maybe that game didn't age as well as I believe it did. So what I did was, after I finished recording this early footage you're seeing here, I popped in Super Mario 64, and sure enough, I didn't have any of these issues. The PlayStation version does feature dual analog controls from what I've been told, however that's obviously not an option on the Saturn version. And yes, it certainly plays better with the analog Saturn pad, but without that second analog stick to control the camera, it's pretty much always an annoyance. Croc is actually an impressive game for both the PlayStation and the SEGA Saturn. For a game to look this nice and detailed on those two machines is a testament to the team at Argonaut. And it's true that gameplay areas are much smaller than something you would find in Super Mario 64, and there are some short load times between areas, but overall it's still a very impressive game from a technical standpoint for that particular point in time. All the little touches, from the way enemies disappear to the way enemies are always smiling, make this one charming game. One that really would have felt right at home on the N64. With some assistance from Nintendo, I could truly see this being played as a really good 3D Yoshi game. But alas, it was just never meant to be. Croc takes a lot of elements from existing games such as Gex, Super Mario 64, and even Sonic the Hedgehog due to the health system. But thanks to its loose camera controls, it's really hard to recommend this one on the SEGA Saturn. Funny thing to note is that on the back of the instruction manual, it actually teased Croc 2 coming holiday 1998, which naturally never happened as the Saturn would be pretty much dead by then. Croc would eventually become another Sony exclusive franchise for its time, even though Croc was going to be a Saturn exclusive, believe it or not, at one point in time. But, as always with Sega and with the Saturn, the industry had other plans.